I will not accept that woman as my mother-in-law. She said it without raising her voice at all. 34 years old, perfectly composed, one finger pointed straight at the dying old woman in her husband's arms. And her husband was Zane Marchetti. In Chicago, there weren't many people who'd say that name out loud in a crowded room. 37 years old, 9 blocks of riverfront in his name, a gate up in Lake Forest that cost more than most families earn in a decade. He hadn't had to ask anyone's permission for anything in 15 years. 40 guests were standing behind her in that foyer. So was a sitting judge. And Zane was still holding the woman he'd picked up off cracked concrete 2 hours earlier, behind a condemned shelter his own crew was 4 days from tearing down. An elderly woman, weathered by years on the streets, soaked blanket, lips already gone blue. She weighed almost nothing at all. Somebody had called 911 back there, 20 minutes before he showed up, and in that part of town that didn't mean much. She'd opened her eyes, looked straight up into his face, and said one word. Nobody had called him that in 28 years. Not a friend, not one of his own men, not a single living person, and the only man who'd ever called him that was buried when Zane was 9 years old. As for his mother, she wasn't buried at all. A judge had signed a piece of paper declaring her dead, and Zane had kept a copy of that paper in a folder most of his life. He carried the old woman up those steps anyway. If a story about dignity and family is worth your time tonight, tap that like button for us. Share it with somebody who needs to hear it. And hit subscribe, because we tell one of these every single week. Now let's go back to that wet afternoon behind the shelter, and to the one word that brought the most dangerous man in Chicago to his knees. Passerotto. That was the word. She said it a second time, quieter, as if she wasn't sure the first one had landed anywhere. And Zane Marchetti stayed exactly where he was, one knee down on wet concrete, and asked her the only question that came to him. What did you just call me? His voice didn't rise. It never had to. The 3 or 4 people who'd drifted over to watch heard it anyway, and 2 of them stepped back without being told, the way people step back from a man whose name they've heard in a bar and never expected to hear a voice attached to. The old woman didn't answer him with words. She moved her hand, and it took her a long moment, the kind of long moment that tells you how much a person is spending to do something small, and then her fingers opened. There was a medallion in her palm, copper, worn down to a shine in the middle where a thumb had been rubbing it for decades. The raised figure on the front nearly gone, just a suggestion of a man carrying something across water. Zane took it. He didn't ask permission, and she didn't need to give it. He turned it over. On the back, scratched into the metal with the point of a knife by somebody who hadn't been in a hurry, were 4 characters and 1 word, D.M. And under that, Passerotto. He looked at it for maybe 2 seconds. Anybody watching him would have said he felt nothing at all, and that was the point of the last 15 years, that nobody watching him could ever say otherwise. But somewhere under his ribs something had come loose and started falling and hadn't hit bottom yet. He put the medallion in his coat pocket. Then he did what he always did when a situation stopped making sense, which was to take control of the ground he was standing on. He pulled his phone out. He didn't call for an ambulance. He had a doctor on retainer, a man who took Zane's calls at any hour of the day or night and had never once asked why. And he called that man and told him to be at the Lake Forest house within the hour, and to bring whatever he'd bring for advanced hypothermia and cardiac failure in a woman in her 60s. Then he hung up and called his site manager. The man answered on the first ring, the way people did. The clearance order on the Cathcart lot, Zane said. Pull it. There was a pause on the line, and the site manager said something about the demolition permits, about the contractor already being scheduled, about 4 days. Pull it, Zane said again, in exactly the same tone. No crews on that lot, no fencing, no equipment, nobody, indefinitely. And I want the names of every person who's been staying back there in the last month. He listened for a second. I don't care what it costs. Pull it. He put the phone away. Behind him, one of the onlookers had gotten a phone out too, and Gabe Aldieri, who'd come around the corner of the building and read the whole scene in about 4 seconds the way he read everything, stepped into the man's line of sight and put a hand out, palm up, and said nothing at all, and the man handed the phone over and left. That was how it worked. Zane crouched lower and got one arm under the old woman's shoulders. She was cold in a way that went past skin, cold the way a stone floor is cold. And when he lifted her, he understood something he'd rather not have understood, which was that she couldn't have weighed more than 90 pounds. He'd carried heavier bags of cement at 19 years old, on a job his father's friends had gotten him. She made a sound when he lifted her, not a word, and her head went against his collarbone like it belonged there, and Zane stood up holding her and started walking toward the car. Gabe fell in beside him. "You want me to drive?" Gabe said. It wasn't a question, and Zane didn't answer it. Gabe went ahead and opened the back door. "Boss," he said, and stopped, and Zane looked at him. 15 years, and Gabe Aldieri had never once had to be told when to stop talking, and he stopped now. "Get the heat on," Zane said. "All the way up." He got in the back with her and didn't hand her off to anybody, and if that struck Gabe as strange, he had the sense to keep it off his face. The car pulled out onto the wet street. Behind them, the Cathcart lot sat empty. 8.5 acres of cracked lot and a boarded building that 9 days from now was supposed to be a hole in the ground, with 3 towers rising out of it. And Zane Marchetti had just killed the schedule on the biggest thing his company had ever done, with 1 sentence, and hadn't paused long enough to think about why. What he did know, sitting in the back of that car with an old woman's head against his shoulder and a piece of copper in his pocket, was that his father had scratched those letters himself. He'd have bet the whole riverfront on it. Donato Marchetti had never owned a thing in his life that he hadn't put his own mark on. She went under somewhere around the on-ramp, and Zane watched her chest to make sure it was still moving, and it was, shallow and slow. And then about 10 minutes north she came back up. She didn't open her eyes. She started to sing. It wasn't much of a sound. It was 3 lines, maybe 4, in a voice that had been sanded down to almost nothing, and it broke twice in the middle, and she had to stop and find her air again, and she sang it anyway. Something about a little bird on a wire above a street. Something about a man coming home late with his hands smelling of soap. Zane didn't know the song. He'd have told you flat out that he'd never heard it in his life, and he'd have meant it. But his hand had come up off his knee and started moving, thumb against his own thigh, keeping time. 2 beats and a rest. 2 beats and a rest. Exactly where the rests belonged. And he only noticed it because the song stopped, and his hand kept going for another measure and a half before it caught up with the silence. He looked down at his own hand like it belonged to somebody else. Gabe was watching the road. Zane was glad of that. Whatever had just happened in the back of that car, he didn't want a witness to it. And he understood at the same time that he'd have to give himself an answer for it eventually, because a body doesn't keep time to a song it's never heard. Then her fingers found his sleeve. They closed on the fabric of his coat, with more strength than a woman that size had any business having left, and her eyes came open, and she wasn't looking at the ceiling of the car, or somewhere past him. She was looking right at him, and she was frightened. And Zane had spent his whole adult life around frightened men, and knew the difference between the kind of fear that comes from not knowing what's about to happen, and the kind that comes from knowing exactly what's about to happen, because it's happened before. This was the second kind. "Don't let her sign the papers again," she said. He waited. "Don't let her sign me away again." "Who?" he said. Her eyes were already going. She said something else, but it didn't come out as words, and then her grip loosened, and her hand slid back down onto the blanket, and she was gone under again. And Zane sat there with a car full of heat, and a woman who weighed nothing, and one word turning over and over in his head. Her. Not them. Not a name, not a place, not an institution, not the city, not the state. Her. Some specific woman, somewhere in this old woman's history, had put her hand on a pen and signed her away, and this old woman had carried the memory of it into a coma in the back of his car, and there was nobody in Zane's world he could think of who fit. He turned it over the rest of the way north. He was still turning it over an hour and a half later, standing in his own front hall with her in his arms and his wife's finger 3 feet from her face, and the whole room holding its breath. And Zane didn't raise his voice because raising his voice would have made it a fight, and he didn't want to fight. He wanted the thing settled. "Point at my mother again," he said, "and you'll be out that door before she is." He'd have to think later about the fact that he'd said my mother. He hadn't decided it. It had just come out of him. Vivian's hand came down. It came down slow, and it went to her side, and it stayed there. Zane knew his wife well enough to watch what happened to her face over the next 2 seconds, and what happened was nothing, and that was the whole story of the next 3 months right there in that nothing. She turned toward the room and she smiled, and it was the smile she used on donors, and on people whose money she needed, and on nobody she loved, and she said something warm about drinks on the terrace and let's give these 2 a moment, and she got the room moving with 2 sentences. She was very good at it. Zane understood that he'd just taken something from her in front of people who mattered to her, in her own house, and that she had swallowed it whole and smiling, and he understood that nothing swallowed like that ever stays down forever. He carried Rosa toward the stairs. Margot Kowalski was at the far end of the corridor with her hands full of nothing, just standing there, and she caught Zane's eye as he came past. 12 years the woman had worked in that house, and she'd never once looked at him the way she looked at him then. She didn't say a word. She didn't step forward. Whatever she had, she kept. And Zane was carrying 80-odd pounds of dying woman up a flight of stairs, and didn't have room in him to wonder what it was. He took her up himself. He didn't hand her to the doctor at the top of the stairs, and he didn't let the doctor's assistant take her feet. He carried her all the way into the east wing, and set her down on the bed himself, and then he stood there for a second, with his hands empty, and no idea in the world what a man was supposed to do next. Sal Ruggiero was sitting in the study when Zane came down, in the chair by the window that he'd been sitting in since Zane was a boy, and Zane hadn't called him. Nobody had called him. 71 years old, and he still knew a thing was happening in that house before the people living in it did. He had a glass of water in front of him, no ice, and he waited until Zane had closed the door before he spoke. "Sit down a minute," Sal said. Zane didn't sit. "Boy." Sal used that word maybe twice a year, and always the same way, and it worked the way it always worked, and Zane sat. "Now you listen to me, because you're going to hear a lot of things in the next few days, and most of them are going to be people telling you what you want to hear." He turned the glass a quarter turn on the desk. "I buried your mother. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? Not somebody's cousin, not a story I heard. I stood next to you that day. You were 10 years old, and you had on a coat that was too big for you because it was your father's, and nobody had gotten around to buying you one." He let that sit. "I stood on your left. I put my hand on your shoulder because your aunt was in no condition. Whoever's upstairs in that room, God help her. Whatever her life has been, she is not your mother. And the sooner you make peace with that, the less it's going to cost you." Zane heard all of it. He heard the coat too, and the coat was true. He could still remember the sleeves coming down past his knuckles. And then he asked a question he hadn't planned on asking, and he asked it in a voice with nothing in it, which was a voice Sal had taught him. "Where's the grave?" Sal didn't blink. He didn't take a breath first either. And that was the thing Zane would come back to later, months later, sitting in a car with the engine off. Because a man remembering something from 27 years ago takes a breath. He goes looking for it. Sal didn't go looking. "St. Adalbert's, out in Niles," he said. "West side of the property, back near the fence line. There's a maple. It's third row in from the path, and the stone's flat to the ground, not upright, because that's what your aunt could afford, and I didn't argue with her about it." He turned the glass back the other quarter turn. "You want to go out there? Go out there. I'll drive you myself. But don't go out there looking for something to make this easier, because it isn't out there." It was, Zane thought, a very good answer. It had a maple tree in it. That night Vivian came into the study a little after 11, when the house had emptied out, and she didn't come in angry. That was the part Zane would have to sit with. She came in with 2 glasses, and she put one down in front of him, and she took the chair Sal had been in. And she said, "I'd like to say this once, all the way through, and then I'll drop it." He told her to go ahead. She knew a nickname, Vivian said. "That's what we have. One word, from a woman who's been living outdoors and who is very sick, and who may not be able to tell you what year it is. I'm not saying she's lying. I'm saying she may believe it completely and still be wrong." She let a beat go by. "And I'm saying somebody may have taught it to her." Zane didn't answer. 3 organizations in this city would pay a great deal of money to put a person inside this house," she said. "Not to hurt you, to listen, and the cheapest way in has never been a man with a gun. It's been somebody nobody would ever think to search. Somebody you'd carry through your own front door with your own 2 hands. You've told me that yourself. About other men. You said the way you get to a careful man is through the one thing he doesn't apply the rules to." She hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't said the woman's name either. "So do the 2 things," she said. "A DNA test. And a proper evaluation. A real one. By somebody who doesn't work for us, so that when she tells you something we know whether it's memory or whether it's a symptom. If she's your mother, Zane, then in 9 days we'll know she's your mother, and I'll be the first one to apologize to her, in front of everybody, and I'll mean it. And if she isn't, you'll have found out from a laboratory instead of finding out in 6 months from a subpoena." She stood up. That's all. You know I'm right about the procedure, even if you hate me for the timing. And the thing was, she was right about the procedure. That was the trouble with Vivian, and it had been the trouble with her for 6 years. Zane sat there a long time after she'd gone, and told himself he was doing the sensible thing. The thing he'd do with any deal, any name, any file that landed on his desk from nowhere with no history behind it. He told himself it was caution. He signed the authorization the next morning. It would be a long while before he understood that caution and doubt wear the same suit, and that his mother, 2 floors above him, was already learning which one had come to visit her. Sal handled the nurse. Nobody asked him to, and nobody was surprised. And he came back 2 days later with 3 folders and put them on the desk in order. Worst on top, and the one he wanted was on the bottom. That was how Sal had always done it. Private duty, 12-hour shifts, 2 nurses rotating, he said. The agency gave me 4 names. I threw out 2. He tapped the bottom folder. This one you'll want. Zane opened it. Kira Callahan, 27 years old, registered nurse, Illinois license active, Bridgeport, South Side, one of those Irish parishes down off Halstead, where the grandmothers still say the rosary in the kitchen, and the family name goes back 4 generations in the same 6 blocks. Good clinical record. 7 years, mostly geriatrics. And then, 3 pages in, the part Sal had brought her for. She'd reported a facility, Northbrook Meadows, one of better than 40 properties Halverson Care Group ran across Illinois, and she'd gone to the state about it, and after that she'd been let go for what the paperwork called scheduling incompatibility. She'd sued. She'd lost. And because she'd lost, the retaliation complaint she filed was still sitting there on the public license lookup like a stain on a shirt, and every staffing agency in Cook County that pulled her name got that first and stopped reading. Zane turned the page. $61,000 in debt. Most of it medical. Some of it a settlement she'd agreed to pay. A 2009 Corolla. 3 shifts a week was all anyone would give her. She's a fighter, Zane said. She was a fighter, Sal said. There's a difference. And the difference is about 2 years long. A person who's already been broken once for making noise doesn't make noise twice. She'll be grateful, she'll be careful, and she'll do exactly what she's told. And if it ever comes down to her word against this house, her word is worthless. Look at the file. It's already been decided that she's a liar. He straightened the folders. You want somebody clean? I'll get you somebody clean. But somebody clean has options. Zane hired her that afternoon. He never asked himself why Sal had wanted her, because Sal had been picking people for the family since before Zane could drive, and Sal had never once been wrong in a way that showed. She started the next morning. She got to the gate at 6:40 and sat in the Corolla for 4 minutes before she came up the drive, because she'd stopped for gas on Waukegan Road and put in $11, which was what she had in the console, and she'd wanted to write down the mileage before she forgot. There was a plastic container on the passenger seat, with rice and beans, and half a chicken breast in it. She had another job Tuesday and Thursday nights, 11 to 7, at a facility in Melrose Park that took anybody, and she'd worked it the night before, and she'd slept in the parking lot for an hour and 40 minutes, none of which she mentioned to the man at the gate, or to Margot Kowalski who let her in, or to anyone else in that house for a long time afterward. She went up to the East Wing, and she started with the chart. She was on her 4th minute of it when she realized somebody was in the doorway behind her, and she turned around. Zane Marchetti was standing there with a phone in one hand, not using it. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the woman in the bed, and Kira had spent 7 years watching families in doorways, and she knew every version of it. The ones who couldn't come in because they were afraid, the ones who couldn't come in because they were ashamed, the ones who came in too much and had to be managed. This wasn't any of those. He was reading the woman. That was the only word for it. Head slightly tilted, absolutely still, going over her the way a man goes over a page of numbers looking for the line that doesn't add up. And he'd been doing it, Kira would learn later, for 11 minutes. She should have said good morning, sir. She should have introduced herself and asked whether he had any instructions. What she said, and she'd wonder about it that night lying in bed, was, "She's still alone with you standing there." He looked at her. It was the first time. "You can come in and sit down," Kira said, "or you can go out and let me work. But don't do that in her doorway." 15 years. 15 years since anybody had told Zane Marchetti what to do in a room he owned, and it had come from a 27-year-old nurse on hour 13 of being awake. And what he felt first wasn't anger. It was something closer to relief, and he didn't have the first idea what to do with that. He put the phone in his pocket. "What's your name?" he said. "Kira Callahan." He looked at his mother a moment longer. Then he came into the room and pulled the chair over from the wall, and he sat down in it, and he didn't say anything else for a quarter of an hour, and Kira went on with her work, as if a man like him, sitting quietly in a chair, was the most ordinary thing in the world. By the third morning, the old woman was well enough to sit up against the pillows for an hour at a stretch, and Kira never once asked her to prove anything. That wasn't a decision Kira made. It simply didn't occur to her that a woman that sick should be spending her breath on a defense. So she asked her the questions she'd have asked anybody. What music did she like? What did the city look like when she was young? Was she afraid of the dark? Because some people were, and there was no shame in it, and Kira could leave the hall light on. Rosa said yes to the hall light. Then she said, "You want the truth? I like one song. There's one song." She had to stop and get her air. "Il Pasero di Taylor Street. It means the sparrow. You won't find it anywhere, honey. Don't go looking. It was never on a record." Kira asked who wrote it, and the old woman's whole face came apart and put itself back together in a way Kira had seen maybe 4 times in 7 years, which was the look of a person being handed back something they'd stopped expecting anybody to ask for. "My husband wrote it," Rosa said. "Donato. He cut hair on Taylor Street. He had the chair by the window, and he sang at the Italian club Saturday nights. And he wrote me that song the year before the baby came." She laughed, or tried to. He wasn't a songwriter. He was a barber who could carry a tune. But that song was mine. Then she said, "You know what he called the boy? Passerotto. It's the same word. Small, the littlest bird." She looked toward the window. "The one nobody counts." Kira wrote none of it down. She'd learn later that she should have, but at the time she was just a nurse sitting on the edge of a bed with her hands in her lap, and what she was doing was listening. And then it started coming. Not in order. Not as an argument. Just the way things come out of an old woman who has had nobody to say them to for a very long time. "He's got a mark on his back," Rosa said. "Left side, under the shoulder blade, about the size of a nickel, shaped like a comma." My mother said it meant the sentence wasn't finished with him yet, and I told her that was a terrible thing to say about a baby. She said her husband used to shave in the mornings with the bathroom door open and sing while he did it, and that the boy would stand in the doorway in his pajamas and watch, and that for years afterward she couldn't hear a man shaving without her hands going cold. She said the boy wouldn't take medicine, not any medicine, not for anything, until she'd figured out at 4 years old that if she stirred it into pear nectar, he'd drink it down and ask for more, and that she'd kept cans of it in the cabinet by the case, and that she'd never once told him what was in it. And then she said the thing that Kira carried out of that room. His father wanted to name him Zane. Rosa's eyes were closed. I said, "That's not a name from our people. Nobody in either family has that name." And Donato said, "That's right." And then he said, "It sounds like a boy who's going to get further than this block does." She was quiet a second. I gave in. I always gave in about the good things. That evening, Kira found Zane in the hall outside the study and told him, standing, because he didn't ask her to sit. She gave it to him plainly, in order, the way she'd give a report to a physician. The song, the barber chair by the window, the mark under the left shoulder blade, the pear nectar, and the naming. He listened to all of it without moving. When she got to the mark, he put one hand flat against the door frame, and Kira noticed it and didn't remark on it, and it stayed there. When she got to the pear nectar, something happened around his mouth that she couldn't read. When she finished, he didn't ask a single question. He said, "Thank you." And then he said, "Is she comfortable?" Kira told him the truth, that she was comfortable for now, that the heart was the thing, and the heart wasn't going to get better, and that he had time, but not a lot of it. He nodded once, and went into the study and shut the door. He didn't go up to the east wing that night. He could have. There was nothing on earth stopping him, and the room was 40 steps from where he was sitting, and he sat there instead, until almost 2 in the morning, with a laptop closed in front of him. Because there were only 2 possibilities. Either that woman upstairs was his mother, in which case Zane Marchetti had spent 27 years being lied to by the man who raised him, or she was the finest piece of work anybody had ever run at him, in which case going up those stairs was exactly what she was counting on. He couldn't tell yet which one it was. So he stayed where he was, and he told himself he was being careful. And 2 floors above him, his mother lay awake in a strange bed with the hall light on, listening for a footstep on the stairs that didn't come. Everybody in that house expected Vivian to cancel the foundation dinner. She moved it up 11 days instead, and she added 14 names to the list. And when Zane asked her why, she said, "Because in about a week, people are going to start hearing something, and I'd rather they hear it here, from us, at a table, than hear it somewhere else from somebody who wasn't invited," which was, again, correct. She asked him one favor. She asked that the woman come down. Not for long, she said. 20 minutes at the table, that's all. Because a woman who's kept upstairs and out of sight becomes a secret. And a secret is the only thing in this city that's actually worth money. Zane said yes to that too. Kira got Rosa down the stairs and into a chair, and Rosa was frightened in a way she didn't say out loud, and Kira stood behind her the whole time with a hand on the chair back, which was not a nurse's job, and which nobody told her to stop doing. Then Vivian stood at the head of 40 people with a glass in her hand and said it. "Before we start, I want to say something. Because I know some of you have heard something, and I'd rather you hear it from me." A pause, warm, unhurried. "This is a woman my husband is helping while we verify her circumstances. It's an unusual situation. We're doing everything properly and carefully, for everyone's sake, including hers." And then she smiled, and she said, "Thank you all for being kind," and she sat down. Nobody laughed. Nobody said a word out of line. That was the thing Zane would go back to for the rest of his life, that not one single person in that room did anything a court could call cruelty. What happened was that the temperature changed. The conversation went on, and the room simply closed around her, and Zane watched it happen from 11 feet away, with a glass in his hand, and understood that his wife had just done in 22 words what a shouted insult couldn't have done in an hour. She had told 40 people that this woman's claim was a question, and that they had permission to treat her as one. Rosa dropped her napkin. It went off her knee and onto the floor beside her chair, and the man next to her, a developer who had been in Zane's house 6 or 7 times and who had a $60 million position with Marquette River Point, moved his chair. That was all he did. He didn't say anything, and he didn't look at her. He shifted his chair 3 inches to the right, away from the napkin and away from her, and went on talking to the woman on his other side. Zane saw it. He saw it completely. He saw Rosa look down at the napkin on the floor, and then look at her own hands, and then leave it there, because she couldn't bend that far, and she knew it, and she understood exactly what had just happened at that table. And she did the thing a person does when they've had it happen before. She sat still and waited for the subject to change, and Kira came around the back of the chair and knelt down and picked up the napkin and put it in Rosa's lap, and said something to her that nobody else heard, and stayed down there on one knee a moment longer than she needed to. Zane did nothing. He stood 11 feet away with a glass in his hand, and he did nothing at all. And he could have crossed that room in 4 steps, and every person in it would have understood. And he stayed where he was. He would think about those 4 steps for the rest of his life. Afterward, when the cars had gone, Gabe Aldieri came and found him out on the side terrace. Gabe never came looking for a conversation, unless it was one he'd already decided to have. "You want it straight," he said. "Go ahead. 3 outfits have repriced you in the last 9 days. Gabe leaned on the rail. "Not because you brought a sick woman home. Because you pulled the cruise off 8.5 acres with 4 days on the clock, and you didn't give anybody a reason. When a man like you does something nobody can explain, everybody assumes there's a reason they can't see, and then they go looking for it. And what they're going to find, Zane, is an old woman in the East Wing." He let it sit. 15 years you've been a man with nothing to take. No kids. Your wife's got her own security, and her own money, and her own name. Nobody's ever had a way in. Now there's a person in that house who can't walk to the bathroom by herself. And she's got your face, and your father's name, and every single person who ever wanted leverage on you just got handed an address. Zane looked out at the dark. "You're telling me to send her away. I'm telling you what it costs to keep her, and it's not money." Gabe straightened up. "You've got to pick one. You keep her, or you keep the chair. I've been doing this a long time, and I've never once seen a man keep both." He went inside. Zane stayed out there a long while. 2 floors up, a light was still on in the East Wing, and he could see the shape of the nurse moving past the window, and he stood in the cold, and did the arithmetic he'd done his whole life, and for the first time it wouldn't come out. Dr. Elliot Corbin came out on a Thursday, 52 years old, 21 of them on retainer to that house, and he was in the East Wing for 19 minutes. He listened to her heart. He asked her 3 questions. Then he came out into the hall and said, to Vivian and not to Kira, "She's agitated at night. She's not sleeping, and at her age and with that heart, sleep is the whole game." He wrote 3 things. Kira read them off the sheet while he was still putting his pen away, and she read them twice, and she didn't say anything at all, and Dr. Corbin looked at her, the way a man looks at a chair he's about to sit in without checking. "Problem, Miss Callahan?" "No, doctor." "Good. 3 medications. All 3 of them acting on the central nervous system. All 3 of them the kind of thing that turns a lucid person foggy and a foggy person quiet, and not one of the 3 carrying a single indication for congestive heart failure." Kira went downstairs to the kitchen and got the little spiral notebook out of her bag, the same one she'd been carrying since 2023, and she wrote the date at the top of a clean page. Drug, dose, time given, who gave it, and how Rosa was 2 hours later. She'd keep that page and the 14 pages after it, and she wouldn't tell one living soul she was keeping them. Zane sent for her on the 6th day. He was behind the desk in the study when she came in, and there was a single sheet of paper turned around to face the chair, and he didn't offer her the chair, and she sat down in it anyway, and read what was in front of her. It was 2 things. The first was a letter of intent regarding an outstanding balance of $61,000, which the letter proposed to satisfy in full, and there was a name at the bottom of it she recognized as a firm downtown that did nothing but make problems go away. The second was a lease. A 2-bedroom on Cleveland Avenue in Lincoln Park, 36 months, paid. And under both of those was the 3rd page, which was the reason for the first 2. An affidavit, attending nurse's statement of observation, prepared but unsigned, attesting that the patient in her care was disoriented as to time and place, unable to reliably identify persons, and in her professional judgment, no longer capable of directing her own affairs. Kira read the whole thing. She read the paragraph twice, then she pushed it back across the desk with 2 fingers. "I lost a job once over a piece of paper exactly like this one," she said. "That time I wouldn't sign it. You can guess the rest." That was all she said. She didn't tell him where. She didn't tell him what the place was called or what she'd seen there or what it had cost her. And she didn't say a word about the license lookup or the lawsuit or the 2 years of 3 shifts a week. She said 11.5 sentences worth of nothing and 1 sentence worth of everything. And then she sat there with her hands in her lap and waited for him to fire her. Zane didn't move for a while. He was aware, in a distant and unwelcome way, that he'd just been refused in his own house for the 2nd time in 9 days by the same woman, and that both times she'd done it without raising her voice, and that he'd have broken a man's arrangement over less. "You understand," he said, "that you'd be signing something a physician's already going to say in a report. Then you don't need mine. It carries more weight from the nurse. You're with her 60 hours a week. That's why it carries more weight," Kira said. "That's the whole reason I'm not signing it." Zane turned the sheet face down. He didn't tear it up, and he didn't put it away, and she noticed both of those things. "Go on back up," he said. She stood. At the door she stopped, and she made a decision that she'd examine later and never fully account for, and she said, "Mr. Marchetti, if she's confused, there's usually a reason a person gets confused, and it's worth knowing which reason it is before somebody writes it down permanent." He looked up. "Meaning what?" "Meaning nothing yet," she said. "I'll tell you when it means something." She went upstairs, and Zane sat there with the affidavit face down under his hand. And what he'd have said if you'd asked him was that he'd hired a stubborn woman from Bridgeport who didn't understand how anything worked. What he couldn't have told you, because he hadn't seen it and wouldn't see it for another 11 days, there was why a private duty nurse making $440 a shift was writing down every dose that went into that woman's body in a spiral notebook she kept in her own bag and took home with her every single night. Rosa slipped in the 2nd week. Not all at once. She'd have a good morning and then she'd sleep through the afternoon and wake up not sure whether it was Tuesday or Sunday. And on the Thursday she called Kira by the name Ellen, twice in the same hour, and then apologized for it and then did it again. She began losing the ends of sentences. She'd start something about the barber shop and get as far as the man who came in every Friday and then just stop. with her mouth still open, waiting for the rest of it to come back, and it wouldn't come back. And she'd close her mouth and look at her hands. Kira wrote all of it down. Zane came into the kitchen at 3 a.m. on the 15th night and found her at the counter with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking. He didn't ask why she was awake. Her shift had ended at 7 that evening and she hadn't left, and neither of them said anything about that either. He got a glass of water he didn't want and stood on the other side of the counter. And after a while he asked her a question, and the fact that he asked it at all was the largest thing he'd done since the afternoon on the concrete. What does a decent death look like? Kira turned her cup a little. You want the honest answer or the comfortable one? Honest. It looks like somebody knowing your name, she said. That's most of it. Warm room, no pain, somebody holding on to you, and somebody in the room who knows your name and uses it. Everything else is medicine, and medicine only gets you so far. Zane didn't say anything, so she went on. And she went on into territory she'd never once taken a family member into, and afterward she couldn't have told you why she did. My mother died in a 4-bed room in a facility up in Northbrook, she said. Northbrook Meadows. I was working there. That's not a coincidence. I got her in there because I worked there and I thought that meant I could watch out for her. She kept her eyes on the cup. She had Lewy body dementia. She'd been a switchboard operator at Illinois Bell for 22 years, and she could still tell you the last 4 of anybody's number from 1970. That was the thing she kept longest. A pause. The nights were hard. She'd get up. She'd want to walk. They're not allowed to tie anybody down. You know that. Nobody puts a hand on anybody. That's not how it's done anymore. She turned the cup again. What they do instead is they get an order written. And it's all legal. And it's all charted. And it's all signed by a physician who saw her for 11 minutes. And by the end, my mother didn't get up at night. And she didn't get up in the daytime either. Zane didn't move. The last 3 days she couldn't finish a word, Kira said. And nobody in that building called her Maureen. She was the 4-bed, or she was the Callahan, or she was the one in bed too. 3 days. My own mother, and the last 3 days of her life not one person in that room said her name out loud, including me, because I was working doubles on the other wing, and I told myself I'd sit with her Sunday. She stopped there. Then she said the thing, and she said it the way a person says a thing they've said to themselves in the car 100 times and never once out loud to anybody. They don't have to hit anybody to erase them, Mr. Marchetti. All they've got to do is make it so the person can't speak clearly anymore. After that, everything you do to them is on paper, and nobody ever has to raise their voice. Zane stood there with a glass of water in his hand. There was a version of this where he told her about the coat that was too big, and the flat stone in the 3rd row in from the path at St. Adalbert's, and the fact that he'd never in 27 years driven out there to look at it. Not once. And that Sal had offered to drive him, and he'd said no. There was a version where he said any of that. He didn't say any of it. What he said was, "Is that what happened to your license?" "That's what happened to my license. You went to the state." "I did. And they did nothing. They fined the Praft, building $11,000, Kira said. And Halverson has better than 40 buildings in this state. And $11,000 is a Tuesday. She finally picked the tea up. "So no, I don't go to the state anymore. I write things down and I keep them. And if it ever matters, I'll have it. And if it never matters, then I'll have wasted some paper." She drank about half of it. "That's the whole system. That's all I've got." Zane set his glass in the sink. At the door he stopped, and he asked her one more thing, and he asked it in the flat voice he used for everything, so that later, Kira wouldn't be sure whether she'd heard what she thought she'd heard. "The confusion upstairs," he said. "Is that the heart?" Kira looked at him for a long moment across that kitchen, and here is the thing she would go over and over for the rest of her life, because she had 14 pages in a notebook in her bag, and a suspicion she couldn't yet stand behind, and she'd been destroyed once for saying a thing out loud before she could prove it. "I don't know yet," she said. And Zane went to bed, and the man he was going to have to become was still 11 days away. The watch went missing on a Monday. Vivienne mentioned it at breakfast. Once, lightly, the way you mention a thing you assume you've misplaced yourself. A Patek Philippe, her grandmother's, the only piece in that house she'd ever said out loud she cared about, and she said she was sure it would turn up, and asked Margot to keep an eye out, and then she changed the subject, and didn't bring it up again for 2 days. On Wednesday afternoon she asked Zane, over the top of her laptop and without much interest, whether he'd mind if the house was looked at properly. "Not searched," she said. "Looked at, and Zane said fine. They found it in 11 minutes. It was in the pocket of a coat hanging in the closet of the east wing. An old wool coat that Rosa had come into that house wearing, and that nobody had thrown out, because nobody had asked whether they could. The man from security carried it downstairs in his gloved hand, and by the time Zane got up there, Rosa was sitting on the edge of the bed with her feet not quite reaching the floor, and Kira was standing beside her, and nobody in the room was saying anything. Zane looked at the watch, then he looked at his mother, and here is what he saw, and what he would spend a long time afterward trying to unsee. She wasn't frightened the way a person is frightened when they've been caught. There was no calculation running behind her eyes, no scramble for a story. She was shaking, and it was a small shake, in the hands mostly. And what was in her face was something Zane had seen exactly twice before in his life. Both times across a table from men who had just worked out that nothing true they said was going to be believed, and that everything from here on out was going to happen to them rather than be decided with them. She had gotten to the end of her own word. That was all. "I don't know how that got in there," Rosa said. She said it once. She didn't say it a second time. And she didn't cry. And she didn't reach for her son's hand. And she didn't say the thing she could have said, which was, "I am your mother. Look at me." She said it once, and then she folded her hands in her lap and she waited. Because she had been in rooms like this before, and she knew that the waiting was the whole job now. Vivienne came in behind Zane. She didn't look at the watch, and she didn't look at the old woman. And she put a hand on her husband's arm, and she said it quietly, so that it was almost only for him, but not quite. "I'm not angry at her." A breath. "I want you to hear that. I'm not angry at her, Zane. She's had a life I can't imagine, and a life like that teaches people things, and I'd probably have learned the same things. I'm angry at whatever taught her." She let go of his arm. "But I have to think about this family. That's all I've ever been doing." Kira spoke then, and she spoke to Zane and not to Vivienne. And she kept her voice level, because she'd learned a long time ago what happens to a nurse who gets loud. "Mr. Marchetti, 3 days ago I buttoned her cardigan for her because she couldn't do the second button. She can't do the second button on her own sweater. She didn't move from beside the bed. That jewelry case has a key. It's a small key. Ask yourself how a woman who can't manage a button crossed a hallway, opened a locked case, chose one piece out of 9, closed it, went back, and hung a coat up straight. Ask the doctor. Don't ask me. Ask Dr. Corbin. He'll tell you what her grip strength is." Vivienne turned and looked at her for the first time. She wasn't hostile. That was the worst of it. That she wasn't even hostile. "You're a nurse," she said gently. "Not an investigator." And she smiled at Kira, and it was a kind smile. And then she looked back at her husband and waited. Zane said nothing. He stood in that room with a watch in a gloved hand to his left, and his mother on the bed in front of him, and the arithmetic he'd been running for 2 weeks came out for the first time, and it came out wrong, and he let it. He didn't tell Kira to be quiet. He didn't tell Vivienne she was mistaken. He didn't cross the 4 feet to the bed and put his hand on his mother's shoulder, which was all it would have taken. One hand on a shoulder in front of witnesses, and he knew it was all it would have taken. He stood there. He let the silence run 12 seconds, and then 15, and then 20. And a silence that long in a room like that isn't a silence at all. It's a verdict. Everyone in there heard it. His mother heard it most of all, and she looked down at her hands, and something in her posture changed. Some small settling, the way a house settles when the last of the weight comes off a beam. Then Zane said, "Put it back in the case," and he walked out. Behind him, Kira sat down on the edge of the bed next to a woman who was no longer shaking, which was worse, and neither of them said anything for a long time. And downstairs a door closed with the particular softness of a door being closed by somebody who has just gotten exactly what she came for. The laboratory result came in on a Friday morning, and it came as a portable document file attached to an email with a case number in the subject line, and Zane read it standing up in the study with his coat still on. Probability of maternity. 99.99%. He read it 3 times. Then he sat down and put the phone face down on the desk and stayed that way for about 4 minutes. And what he felt was not what he'd expected to feel. He'd expected relief. What arrived instead was the understanding that a woman had been in his house for 19 days, had been introduced to 40 people as a question, had had a watch pulled out of her coat pocket in front of him, and had been his mother the entire time. He'd asked for that piece of paper himself. He'd told himself it was the sensible thing, and now he had it. and it had come 6 days too late to be worth anything to her, and the only thing it was good for was what other people were about to do with it, which took less than a day. That evening Sal was in the study again, and Vivienne came in with him, and the two of them had reversed themselves completely, and neither one of them stumbled doing it. Not she's an imposter, not somebody taught her that nickname. Now it was, she's your mother. God bless her. And she is not competent to manage her own affairs. You understand what changed today? Sal said. You've got a living parent. On paper. Intestate succession. Spousal claim against your father's estate that was closed in '99. A share in anything with his name on the original paper. And if you die before her, which men in this business do, she's got standing. Not a claim, Zane. Standing. He leaned forward. And she's a woman who can't tell you the day of the week, sitting 2 floors above $40 million of instruments she could be induced to sign. And there are 5 people in this city who'd have a lawyer in that room inside a week, if they knew what I know. Vivienne said, it isn't about protecting the money from her. It's about protecting her from everyone who wants it. And Zane, sitting there, heard the shape of it, and couldn't find the seam. What Sal was describing was a real exposure. He'd have said the same words himself about anybody else's mother. He asked for the hallway footage the next morning. He wanted to see the closet. That was all. He wanted to see the 11 minutes before the coat, and the 4 hours before that, and he told the technician to pull the whole day. The man came back after an hour and a half with a strange face on him. The footage from that Monday wasn't corrupted. It wasn't overwritten. It had been deleted, deliberately, by a credentialed user, at 9:40 in the evening, on the Tuesday, from a terminal, and the terminal was the one in Vivienne's private office off the 2nd floor landing. Zane looked at the log for a long time. Then he did a thing he'd never done in his life, which was to fold a piece of information up and put it in his pocket instead of acting on it. And he told the technician that he'd handle it, and the technician was smart enough to say yes, sir, and never mention it again. He didn't confront her. He couldn't have told you why, or he could have, and didn't want to. Which was that his wife had built the last 6 years of that house and the foundation and half his legitimate front, and if that log meant what it looked like it meant, then everything Zane thought he'd been standing on for 6 years was a stage set, and he wasn't ready. The capacity evaluation was Monday afternoon. Dr. Corbin brought a second physician, a neuropsychologist from a practice in Winnetka, who had never met anybody in that house and whose independence was, Vivienne pointed out, exactly what everyone had asked for. They sat with Rosa for 80 minutes. Kira was not permitted in the room. She stood in the hall outside the door with her hands at her sides for the whole 80 minutes, and Margot Kowalski brought her a chair, and she didn't sit in it. Inside, they asked Rosa what year it was, and she said 1999. And then she corrected herself and said no, and then she couldn't get to the right one. They asked her the name of the current president, and she got it, and she was pleased with herself for getting it. And that pleasure was worse to watch than the failure. They asked her to name the woman who cared for her every day, and she said, Ellen. And then she said, no, wait. And she tried. She tried for 11 seconds, which is a very long time, with her mouth working and her eyes going around that room looking for the word. And then she gave up and looked at her hands and said, the girl, the one with the hands. When it was over, the neuropsychologist came out into the hall, and he was not an unkind man. And he said to Kira, how long has she been like this? And Kira said, 9 days, doctor. And he wrote something down, and he did not ask her what she meant by that, and he never asked her again. The report ran 11 pages. Its conclusion took 1 sentence. And upstairs, Rosa asked Kira twice that evening whether her son had come by, and Kira told her the truth both times, which was no. Sal filed the petition on Tuesday morning in the probate division of the Circuit Court of Cook County, emergency temporary guardianship of the person, and he filed it with the 11-page report attached, and a physician's affidavit, and a proposed order already drafted. These things take 3 weeks. They take a month. Judge Warren Pell, 66 years old, 22 of them on that bench, signed it in 48 hours without a hearing, and Sal came back to the house on Thursday afternoon with the order in a folder, and didn't remark on the speed of it, and Zane didn't ask. The placement was Bellhaven Gardens, out in Barrington. Stone floor in the lobby, a grand piano nobody played, and a wing on the 2nd floor where the doors locked from the corridor side, and everybody who worked there called it the memory unit. Zane went out and walked it himself. He stood in that corridor for a while and then he came home. Sal laid the transfer papers on the desk in the study on Friday and stood on the other side of it with his hands behind his back. "I want to say one thing to you and then I'll be quiet," he said. "This isn't cruelty, boy. It's necessity. You've got a mother who's got maybe a year left, and she'll get it in a warm building with a nurse on every hall and somebody checking on her every 2 hours through the night, which is better than she's had in 27 years. And you get to run your business without 5 families in this city holding a knife to your one soft place." He tapped the papers once. "In 20 years, when you're the age I am, you'll know that a man who protects everything he's responsible for sometimes has to do it in a way that makes him sick. And you'll have done it. And you'll have all of it still standing." Zane read the whole document. That was the thing. He read all 9 pages of it, front to back, and there was no trick in it, and nobody rushed him, and nobody put a hand anywhere near his shoulder. He understood exactly what he was doing, and exactly what it would cost her, and he sat there with a pen in his hand for a long moment, and the arithmetic he had run his whole life came out this time, clean, on one side of the ledger, and he signed. 231 seconds. That's how long it took. He'd worked out the number later, from the timestamps on the notarization, the way another man might count the steps to a gallows. They brought her down at 4. She didn't struggle, and she didn't ask a question, and she didn't say a single word to Vivienne, who wasn't there anyway, and she let them help her into her coat, the wool one, which nobody thought about. At the bottom of the stairs she stopped and turned and looked at her son. Just once. He was standing 11 feet away, and neither of them moved toward the other. "A room with white sheets," she said. "That locks from the outside is still a room that locks from the outside. Passerotto." Then she turned around and went out to the car and let the man from the service close the door for her, and that was the last thing his mother said to him for 19 days. Kira was standing in the doorway of the mudroom. Her shift had ended at 7 that morning. She had no business being in that house at 4 in the afternoon, and she was in that house at 4 in the afternoon, and she had watched the whole thing from 30 feet away with her bag over her shoulder. And when Zane came back in, she was still there. He'd have walked past her. She said his name, and he stopped. "You just did the exact same thing they did to my mother." That was all. She didn't cry, and she didn't raise her voice, and she didn't call him a coward. She said one sentence, and she looked at him while she said it, and then she went out the side door and got into a 2009 Corolla and drove to a night shift in Melrose Park. Vivienne terminated her that evening by telephone. Cause listed as scope of engagement concluded. Zane didn't sleep. Around 1 in the morning, he got in a car by himself, which he almost never did, and he drove out to Niles and parked outside the gates of St. Adalbert's, and sat there until the groundskeeper came at 6:30 and opened up. He didn't need directions. 3rd row in from the path, west side, near the fence line, and there was the maple, exactly where Sal had said it would be, and there was the flat stone in the grass, exactly the kind you buy when there isn't money for anything upright. Rosalind Marchetti, and 2 dates. Zane stood over it in the cold with his hands in his coat pockets, and he stood there long enough that the groundskeeper came over to ask if he needed anything, and Zane asked him a question he had absolutely no reason to ask. A question that came out of him the way my mother had come out of him 3 weeks earlier at the front door. He asked whether there was an interment record. The man took him into the office and pulled the book, because it was a Catholic cemetery and Catholic cemeteries keep everything, and he ran his finger down the ledger for the plot, and then he ran it down again. Then he went and got another book. There was a stone. There was a plot, paid in full, 1999, by a firm downtown. There was no interment. Nobody was buried under that stone. Nobody ever had been. The call came at 9:20 that night while Kira was clocking in at Melrose Park, and it lasted 41 seconds. Scope of engagement concluded. Mrs. Marchetti thanked her for her service. The final check would be mailed. Kira said thank you, because she'd learned what happens to a nurse who says anything else. And then she worked 8 hours and drove home to Cicero at 7 in the morning and sat down on the edge of her bed in a studio apartment with the shades down and didn't sleep. She got up at 11 and made coffee and got the notebook out of her bag. She wasn't looking for anything. That's the part she'd say afterward. When people asked her how she found it, she wasn't looking. She was doing the things she'd done every time she lost a patient in 7 years, which was to go back through her own charting and see whether she'd missed something, because that was the only way she knew of to sleep again. 15 pages. Drug, dose, time, who gave it, how the patient presented 2 hours later. She copied it out onto a legal pad in columns, because it was easier to see that way, and she started at the top. And on the second pass through, the thing came up off the page at her, and sat there and would not go away. 3 central nervous system agents, not one of them with an indication for congestive heart failure, all 3 known to produce confusion, disorientation, and slurred word-finding in patients over 65, and known to produce a great deal more than that when they're given together, and known to be poorly cleared by a body with a failing heart, which meant every dose stacked on the one before it. Kira had seen that combination twice in 7 years, both times in the same building in Northbrook. Then she went and looked at the dates, and her hand stopped moving. On the 9th of the month, all 3 doses had doubled. Not one of them, all 3, the same day, the same order. No change in her weight, no change in her heart, no new complaint charted anywhere by anybody. Kira sat there with her finger on the 9th and counted forward on the calendar on her phone. 7 days. The capacity evaluation had been on the 16th. 7 days at double dose was almost exactly the interval a nurse would choose if a nurse wanted a patient at her absolute worst on a particular afternoon and wanted the deterioration to look gradual instead of sudden. She got up and walked the length of that apartment, which took 4 steps, and came back and looked at the page again, and the thing she'd been holding away from herself for 19 days finally came all the way in. Rosalind Marchetti had not lost her mind. Somebody had taken it from her, on paper, in 9 days, with a physician's signature on every line of it, and Kira Callahan had stood in a hallway with her hands at her sides and watched it happen, and had written every dose down, and had not said the word out loud. 9 days, doctor. She'd said that to a neuropsychologist in a hallway, and he hadn't asked her what she meant, and she hadn't made him ask. She didn't call the police. She'd been to the state once with 14 pages, and a dead mother, and it had cost $11,000 of somebody else's money and everything she had, and she knew exactly what a report gets you when the other side has a physician, a court order, and a firm downtown. What she did instead was call Denise Pruitt, who'd been her charge nurse at Northbrook, and who'd left before all of it, and was now in medical records at Halverson's corporate office in Schaumburg. They talked about nothing for 6 or 7 minutes. Then Kira asked her, as a favor, to run a name. She said it was a family thing. Rosalind Marchetti. Denise called her back 40 minutes later, and her voice was careful in a way that told Kira she'd already noticed something. There was no Rosalind Marchetti in the Halverson system. Never had been. Not in 42 properties. Not in any year the database went back to. But Denise had run the birth date, because that's what you do, and she'd gotten 1 hit. Rose Marino. Same birth month, same day, same medical history. Admitted to Riverbend Manor in Kankakee County in the spring of 2000. Private pay. Discharged, transferred, readmitted, transferred again. And eventually the record went quiet when funding stopped, leaving her to drift through city shelters for years before ending up behind that lot. Kira wrote the name down. Rose Marino. She looked at it on the legal pad next to the column of doubled doses and the date of the 9th, and she sat in a folding chair in a studio apartment in Cicero, with a night shift starting in 11 hours, and she put the pen down. Because these weren't 2 things. She'd been carrying them as 2 things, a nursing question and a family curiosity, and they weren't. Somebody had taken that woman's name away from her in 2000, and had been taking it away from her ever since. And 3 weeks ago she'd turned up on a lot behind a boarded building, and the very first thing that happened after her own son brought her home was that somebody started writing her out again with a pen. Same method, 26 years apart, which meant it was the same hand, or a hand that had learned from it, and either way it meant there was somebody in that house who had done this before and knew it worked. Kira found Margot Kowalski on a Thursday, on her day off, at a bakery on Milwaukee Avenue where Margot had been buying the same bread every week for 30 years. She'd gotten the address from the staff list she'd been given her first day and never turned back in. Margot saw her come in and knew immediately what she was there about, and she put both hands flat on the table and didn't pretend otherwise. 58 years old, 12 years in that house, and she'd been sleeping about 4 hours a night for 2 weeks. She let Kira ask one question. Then she talked for 11 minutes without being asked another one. The Saturday, Margot said. 2 days before Mrs. Marchetti said anything about it being missing, I came up the back hall with the linens, and she was at the coat closet, and she had that watch in her hand, and she put it down into the pocket of that old wool coat, and she smoothed the coat straight on the hanger with 2 hands, like you'd straighten a picture. and she turned around and she saw me. A pause. She said, "Good afternoon, Margot." That's all she said. "Good afternoon, Margot." And I said, "Good afternoon, ma'am." And I carried the linens down to the laundry, and I stood down there for about a half hour. She turned her coffee cup a quarter turn, and Kira thought of somebody else who did that with a glass. 12 years. I've got a daughter at Loyola with 2 years left, and I pay it. I told myself it wasn't my business, and that a woman my age doesn't get another job like that one. Her voice didn't break. That was the thing Kira remembered. Nothing about her broke. I told myself keeping quiet was knowing my place. Margot looked up. It wasn't. It was cowardice. I'm 58 years old, and I only just learned the right word for it. And I watched them put that woman in a car. And I knew what I knew, and I stood at the end of the hall with a laundry basket. She wrote it out longhand on 2 sheets of paper right there at the table, dated it, and signed it, and she asked Kira for a photograph of the pages on her phone as well, which was a shrewder instinct than Kira had expected. Kira took the bus to Lake Forest the next morning, 2 transfers and a 1.25 mile walk up from the road, because the Corolla had a wheel bearing going and she wasn't spending $40 she didn't have on it that week. She had 3 things in a folder in a plastic grocery bag, 15 pages of doses in her own handwriting, photographs of a Halverson system record for a patient named Rose Marino, admitted spring of 2000, and Margot Kowalski's 2 sheets of paper. The man at the gate called the house. She stood out there for 19 minutes. Zane read all of it standing up at the desk in the study without sitting down and without saying a word. And he read the dose columns twice. And when he got to the 9th of the month and the doubling, he stopped and put 1 finger on the line and left it there. Then Rose Marino. Then Margot's 2 pages. It took him 11 minutes. Kira watched a thing happen to his face over those 11 minutes that she had no name for and would never try to describe to anybody afterward. He set the last page down. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't say he'd been wrong, or that he'd fix it, or any of the words a man in that position reaches for, and Kira would think later that if he'd reached for a single one of them, she'd have walked back out that gate. What he said was, "What do I do?" 4 words, from a man who hadn't asked anybody that question in 15 years. And he asked it looking straight at her. "Get her off those 3 medications," Kira said. "That's first, and it's today. Because every day she stays on them, she loses ground. She doesn't get back at that age. Then go out there and sit with her. Not to apologize. She doesn't need an apology. She needs somebody to ask her a question and wait for the whole answer." She picked up the empty grocery bag and folded it. "And I want to be clear about something. I didn't come here for you. I came here because that woman told me about a song nobody ever recorded and I'm the only person left who's heard it." She went out. Zane stood there, and Gabe Aldieri, who had been standing in the hall for the last 4 minutes of it because Gabe was always standing somewhere, waited until the front door closed, and then came in and shut the study door behind him. "The hallway server," Gabe said. Zane looked at him. "The system got replaced in 2019. Everything runs through the new one." Gabe put his hands in his pockets. "In 2016, I put a parallel recorder in the closet in the security room. Separate drive, writes on a 240-day loop. No network. It isn't on any inventory. Nobody's touched it in 7 years because nobody knows it's in there." He was quiet a second. "It was running that Saturday." Zane said, "Why are you telling me this?" And Gabe said, "Because you asked her what to do." That was all he said about it. Then or ever. The 3 medications came off her chart that same afternoon. Zane made 2 calls, and did not raise his voice on either one of them. And the second call was to a cardiologist at Northwestern, who had never in his life taken a retainer from anybody, and by 6 that evening there was a physician of record at Bellhaven, who didn't work for that house and didn't intend to. Then he waited 3 days. Because Kira had told him 3 days, and he'd stopped arguing with her about clinical matters. He drove out to Barrington on the 4th morning by himself. No car behind him, no Gabe, nobody at the wheel but him. He wore a sweater. He'd stood in front of a closet for a good while over that, which was a ridiculous thing for a grown man to do, and he knew it while he was doing it. And in the end, he took a suit off the hanger and put it back and wore a gray sweater and a pair of boots, because he'd worked out that his mother had never once in her life seen him in a suit, and that everybody who'd ever come to take something from her had been wearing one. She was sitting up in a chair by the window when he came in, not in the bed, and somebody had brought her a cup of tea, and she'd actually drunk some of it. The change in 3 days was not subtle. She looked at him and she knew him, immediately, without the 11 seconds of searching, and she said, You came out here yourself." She didn't ask why he'd come. She didn't ask why it had taken 19 days, or what had happened to the girl who used to do her buttons, or whether he'd read something or been told something or found something out. Zane had come out there with a whole speech in him. He'd built it in the car, and it had the watch in it, and the doses, and the fact that he'd read 9 pages and signed anyway, and he never said one word of it, then or later, because his mother asked him a question first. "Do you still know how to sit still and listen to a whole sentence?" He said, "No." "Well," she said, "you used to." And then she waited, and Zane Marchetti sat down in a vinyl chair in a room in Barrington, and did not speak for the better part of 40 minutes, and let his mother talk about small things. The barber chair by the window, and the man who came in every Friday whose name she got all the way to this time. What the bakery on Taylor Street smelled like at 5 in the morning when the trucks came. A dog that used to sleep on the sidewalk outside the Italian club, and belonged to nobody, and was fed by everybody. She didn't tell him where she'd been for 27 years. She didn't tell him about Riverbend, or the years after Riverbend, or the winter she'd stopped writing letters, and he understood that she was choosing not to, and that the choosing was hers to do, and he sat in the chair and let her have it. When she got tired, she stopped, and she looked out the window a while, and then she said, "You've still got the medal." He took it out of his coat pocket. He'd been carrying it for 22 days. She held out her hand and he put it in her palm, and her fingers closed around it the way a person's fingers close around a thing they've held so many times. The hand does it without asking. Then she turned it over. "Your father was a barber," she said. "Everything he had, he'd take apart to see how it went together. Drove me out of my mind." She got a thumbnail up under the rim of the back plate, right at the edge where the copper had worn thinnest, and pressed. It took her 2 tries. The back came away. Not off, just up, on the little bit of solder that had held it since before Zane was born, and there was a hollow underneath it about the size of a dime and a quarter deep, and there was a piece of paper folded 4 times inside it. Zane didn't reach for it. His mother worked it out with 2 fingers and unfolded it herself, and it took her a while, and she flattened it on her knee. It was not a letter. It was 6 words in pencil, in handwriting Zane had seen once before in his life on the back of a photograph in his aunt's kitchen, and the pencil had gone soft with age, but the pressure of the hand was still there in the paper. Santa Lucia. Under the sacristy floor, 3rd board from the door. Rosa looked at it a long moment. "He put things where nobody would think to look," she said. "He learned that from losing things nobody thought to protect." She held it out to her son. Zane took it and read it 4 times. Santa Lucia was 11 minutes from the barber shop. It was the parish his father had sung in on Saturday nights, and it was still standing. And Zane Marchetti had been writing that parish a check every December for 9 years, and had never once walked through the door. Father Emil Zielinski was 74 years old, and had been at Santa Lucia for 31 of them. And when Zane said the words under the sacristy floor, the old priest didn't ask him what he was talking about. He went and got a claw hammer out of a utility closet and handed it to Kira, because his hands weren't good anymore, and he said, "3rd board from the door. I've walked over it about 11,000 times." Kira had come because Zane had called her and said one sentence, which was, "She'd want you there." The board came up in 2 pieces. Underneath, in the space between the joists, sitting on the dirt in a shallow well somebody had scooped out by hand, was a metal box about the size of a bread pan, rusted through at the corners and still shut tight. Zane got it out and set it on the floor and sat down on the floor beside it. And Kira sat down across from him. And Father Emil pulled a chair over and lowered himself into it. Nobody said anything. Zane opened it. The first thing was a photograph. A young woman, 29 or 30, sitting on the front steps of a 2-flat with an infant across her forearms, squinting into the sun, laughing at whoever was holding the camera. Zane looked at it for a while and then handed it to Kira without a word. And Kira looked at it and set it face up on the floor beside her knee where it stayed for the rest of the afternoon. The second thing was a letter, 4 pages, in the same pencil hand as the 6 words in the metal, folded around 2 bus tickets and a receipt, Chicago to Rockford, both dated the 9th of October, 1998, both unused. The receipt was an earnest money deposit, $1,100, on a house on North Rockton Avenue in Rockford, Illinois. The letter was to Rosa. Most of it was ordinary. Where the money was, what to do about the shop lease, which of his brother's friends she was not to accept help from under any circumstances. And 2/3 of the way down the third page, in the middle of a paragraph about the furnace, he'd written it plainly. I'm asking out. They don't let a man ask out. If I've read this wrong, then you'll never see this letter and I'll feel like a fool for a year. And I'd rather feel like a fool. Donato Marchetti had died 5 days after the date on those bus tickets. The third thing was a hospital admission record. 1 page, photocopied. Patient name, Rose Marino. Date of birth, 1959. Admitted to Riverbend Manor, Kankakee County, Illinois, on the 14th day of April, 2000. Zane sat on the floor of the sacristy and did the arithmetic twice, out loud, quietly, because his mind wouldn't hold it silently. The order declaring his mother dead had been entered in February of 1999. That admission record was 14 months later. 14 months after a court in Cook County had put its seal on a piece of paper saying she no longer existed. A private facility 90 miles south had been taking her in under a name that wasn't hers and billing somebody for it. The fourth thing answered who. It was a ledger, black cover, the cheap kind you buy at a stationer's, and it was kept in a hand Zane had been reading his whole adult life on birthday cards and legal memos and the backs of envelopes. Salvatore Ruggiero had recorded every payment himself. Monthly, private pay, Riverbend Manor, and then 2 other facilities after it, beginning in 2000. He'd written the amounts and the check numbers and, in the far column, the notation RM, so that anybody who came across the book would have to work for it. The entries ran 9 years. Then, eventually, they stopped. There was nothing after that. No note, no explanation, no final line. The payments simply ended, and Zane understood, sitting on that floor with the book open on his knees, that his mother's remaining silent years had happened in the blank space at the bottom of that page. Father Emile spoke then, for the first time in half an hour. In the spring of 1999, Salvatore Ruggiero came to this parish, he said. He sat in the office, and he asked me whether we held any records on Rosalind Marchetti, baptismal, marriage, choir enrollment, anything with her name on it. The old priest looked at his own hands. I told him no. I told him the flood in the basement in '92 had taken all of it. He was quiet a moment. I have lied once in my life, Mr. Marchetti. I lied that afternoon, and I lied to keep this box, because your father had brought it to me 8 months before that, and asked me not to tell my successor, and I understood then that a man doesn't ask a thing like that of a priest unless he's already afraid. Then he said the last of it. She was living at the Cathcart residence for women that year, on the near south side. Your father's letter went to her there and came back, and she came here twice looking for him, and then she stopped coming. He raised his head. She had exactly one address in this world she was sure of, and that was it. Zane looked up. 8.5 acres. 4 days from the machines. He was still holding that when he got to the last thing in the box, and the last thing was a single page, a supplemental toxicology worksheet from the Office of the Medical Examiner of Cook County, dated the 22nd of October, 1998, marked as an addendum and never filed with anything. His father's name at the top, and one finding at the bottom, listing a substance in his father's blood at a level no man walks around with, a substance no physician had ever prescribed to him, and Zane Marchetti sat on the floor of that sacristy and did not get up for a long time. Zane went to Sal's office on Ashland the next morning and set the metal box on the desk and opened it, and he didn't say a word. He let Sal look. 71 years old, and Salvatore Ruggiero went through that box the way a man goes through a hand of cards he already knows he's lost, item by item, and when he got to his own ledger, he stopped and closed the cover and put one hand flat on top of it, and he still didn't deny anything. Men like Sal don't deny. They negotiate. Sit down, he said. Zane didn't. A 10-year-old with a mother has a weakness, Sal said. You want to know how many men in this city knew, in 1999, that your father had been trying to get out? 6. And every one of them looked at what he left behind and saw a woman in a shelter with no money and a boy. And a woman in a shelter with no money will say anything to anybody for a place to sleep, and a boy who visits her will hear everything she says. That was the arithmetic. He turned the ledger a quarter turn on the desk without looking at it. A 10-year-old with a mother has a weakness. A 10-year-old with nobody has a family. I gave you a family. I fed you. I put you through school. I put your name on the first thing you ever owned when you were 23 years old, and no bank in Illinois would look at you. He raised his eyes. Look around you, Zane. Look at what you've got. Then tell me I was wrong. Zane walked around behind him. There was a wall safe behind that desk that had been there since before Zane could remember, and he'd watched Sal open it 100 times, and he'd known the combination for 11 years because Sal had given it to him himself, which Zane would think about later. He opened it. Cash, 3 passports, a revolver he'd never seen fired, and in the back, under all of it, held together with 2 rubber bands that had gone brittle and cracked when he touched them, a bundle of envelopes, 47 of them. He counted them on the desk, all of them in the same hand, a woman's hand, careful, the way somebody writes when they're worried the address won't be believed. Some of them had return stamps on them, some had been redirected twice. The earliest postmark was 2001, and the last one was 2009, and every single one of them was addressed to Zane Marchetti at 1042 West Taylor Street, which was the flat above the barber shop, which had been sold in 1999, and not one of them was open. That was the thing. 25 years, Sal had kept them, and moved them from safe to safe, and never once opened a single one, and Zane stood there, holding 47 envelopes his mother had written to him, and understood that the man who raised him hadn't even been curious. Sal said, "There was nothing in them that would have helped you." Zane put them down. He said, "You were wrong the day you decided it was yours to decide, not hers, not mine." Then he told Gabe to bring him. There was a warehouse in Cicero off 26th Street that the family had held under 3 different names since 1986, and at 10:30 that night Zane Marchetti stood in it with the lights off except the one over the door, and Sal Ruggiero sat in a folding chair in the middle of that concrete floor, with his hands on his knees, and didn't ask a single question, because he'd been in that building himself a long time ago, and he knew what it was for. Zane stood 11 feet away with his right hand inside his coat. He'd been standing that way for 4 minutes. He wasn't thinking about his father. He wasn't thinking about the toxicology page or the ledger or the 47 envelopes. What he was thinking about, and he'd never tell anybody this, was a room with white sheets and a door that locked from the corridor side, and the fact that his own signature was on the paper that put her in it, and that if he did the thing his hand was ready to do, then the last true thing anybody would ever be able to say about Rosalind Marchetti's son was that he had finished what Sal started. His phone went off in his other pocket. He nearly didn't look. It was an audio file, 44 seconds, and 1 line of text under it. "She asked me where you were." He put it to his ear. It was his mother singing. She was hoarse, and she was flat in 2 places, and she came in half a beat behind herself at the start of the second line, and never quite caught up, and about 2/3 of the way through, she stopped in the middle of a word to get her air, and you could hear her get it, and then she went on. Zane Marchetti stood in the middle of a warehouse in Cicero at 11 at night and listened to all 44 seconds of it. When it ended, he stood there another moment. Then he took his hand out of his coat, empty, and put the phone away, and said, "Gabe, get the lights." The overheads came up, and Sal squinted, and Zane looked at him under all that light and said one thing. "You're not going to die in here. A beat. You're going to sit in a courtroom, and you're going to listen to somebody read her name out loud correctly into a record that doesn't get lost." He turned around and walked out, and left the door open behind him. They all came to the house on a Thursday evening. Gabe pulled the drive off the parallel recorder, and it went up on the wall of the dining room, and there was no sound on it, and it didn't need any. A woman at a coat closet on a Saturday afternoon, a watch in her hand, a coat straightened on a hanger with 2 hands. Nobody in that room said a word for a while. Then Zane put the audit down on the table, the independent one he'd commissioned 9 days earlier, and next to it the Foundation's own public annual filings going back 6 years, and the number in both columns was the same, $9.4 million, out of the Marchetti Foundation, through a consulting company in Delaware with 1 employee. Vivian had been building herself a way out of that marriage since the 2nd year of it, and Sal had known about it since the 4th, and he'd never once asked her for $1 of it, because a woman with a secret like that will do whatever the man who knows it needs done. Vivian didn't cry, and she didn't ask anyone for anything. She looked at the wall a long moment, and then she said the only completely honest sentence Zane ever heard out of her. "I told myself I was protecting this family." A breath. "I think I was only ever protecting my place in it." Judge Warren Pell sat at the end of that table, with his hands folded, and admitted what he'd done in 1999, and what he'd done 6 weeks earlier, and when he finished, he said the thing that Zane would remember out of the whole night. The same signature. Twice. 27 years apart. Zane gave all of it to the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois. All of it. Which meant giving them himself. And he understood exactly what that word meant when he said it. 1 count of financial fraud, forfeiture of a great deal of what he owned, full cooperation, 18 months at the federal camp in Duluth, Minnesota. Before he signed the plea, he transferred the Cathcart lot, all 8.5 acres, to a nonprofit corporation that had been formed the week before, and that he had no ownership interest in whatsoever. Gabe took over what was left of the legitimate side, and he made 3 phone calls that Zane never asked about. And after those 3 calls, nobody in that city ever came looking for anybody. And in March, a judge in the probate division vacated the 1999 order of presumed death. And 11 weeks after that, Rosalind Marchetti had a driver's license with her own name on it for the first time since the last century. She got 7 months. That was the arithmetic nobody wanted and everybody got. And Zane spent every one of those 200 and some days the way a man spends money he knows is running out. Off those 3 medications, she came all the way back. Not her heart. Her heart was gone, and everybody knew it. But she woke at 5 in the morning out of a habit she'd had since she was 19 years old. And Zane stopped trying to talk her out of it, and started getting up with her instead. And they'd sit in the kitchen in the dark and she'd tell him things. She never once told him about the 17 years after the payments stopped. He never once asked. Kira came back as her nurse, and then stopped being paid for it somewhere around the 3rd month, and kept coming anyway. And the 2 of them started taking the bus down to Taylor Street on Tuesdays, the 8 and then the 12, because Rosa said she'd spent enough of her life in the back of cars where somebody else picked the direction. They'd get a coffee and sit on a bench across from where the shop used to be, which was a phone store now. On the 3rd Sunday in May, she sang at Santa Lucia. There was no microphone. Father Emile didn't announce her, and there was no program, and about 60 people were in the pews because it was a regular 10 o'clock mass. And she stood at the front in a blue dress with one hand on the rail and sang Il Passero di Taylor Street all the way through for the first time in 27 years. It was not a performance. She was flat in the same 2 places. And in the last verse, her voice went out from under her completely. And she stopped. And Kira Callahan, who had learned the whole thing off a phone recording in a studio apartment in Cicero, came in from the 2nd row and picked it up and carried it to the end. And Rosa stood there holding the rail and let her. Zane sat in that pew and did not try to hold anything back, and neither did anybody else in that church who had a mother. She died at home in her own bed on a Tuesday morning in July, 2 weeks before her son was due to report to Duluth. And it was quiet, and it wasn't frightening, and he had her hand the whole time. What she said last she didn't say to him. She turned her head toward the chair by the window and said, "You were the first person in 27 years who said my name right the first time." The Sparrow House opened on that lot the following April. Emergency and transitional housing for older women separated from their families, and a legal aid office on the ground floor that does one thing, which is undoing guardianship orders and correcting altered records, and it has never once had an empty bed. Rosalind Marchetti's full name is printed at the bottom of every piece of paper that building produces. Kira is the director of nursing. Margot Kowalski works the front desk and knows every resident's name inside a day. The medal hangs framed by the door where anybody can see it. 18 months later, Zane Marchetti walked out through the gate at Duluth on a cold, clear morning with a paper bag under his arm, and there was no car service and nobody standing in a line. Just Kira Callahan leaning against a 2009 Corolla she still hadn't replaced. He asked her how long she'd been waiting. She said, not as long as she did. They were married in that church the following spring. And the last thing to tell you is this. On an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, an old woman came through the door of the Sparrow House holding a photograph in a plastic sleeve, and she stood in the entry looking at the desk and the hallway and the framed piece of copper, and she had the face of somebody who has already worked out that nobody inside is going to believe her. Zane saw her from across the room. He didn't ask for identification. He didn't ask for a document, or a birth date, or a name he could check against something. He pulled a chair over and sat down beside her, and asked her who she was trying to find. The cruelest thing that ever happened to Rosalind Marchetti wasn't done with a raised hand or a raised voice. It was done with a pen, by people in good suits, who never once said anything you could repeat in a courtroom. And that is worth remembering, because that is how it usually happens. Dignity was never about being a man who had not made the mistake. It was about being a man who stood up in front of everybody and undid it. And in the end, what she needed wasn't money, and wasn't a house, and wasn't even her son's forgiveness. It was for one person to say her name correctly the first time and mean it, And that is a thing every single one of us can give somebody today without spending a dollar. If this story reached you tonight, we'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to the channel and leave a like so we can keep bringing you a story like this every day. And we'd truly love to hear from you in the comments. Has something like this happened in your own family? To your mother? To a neighbor? To someone you loved who got old and stopped being listened to? Tell us what you felt. Honestly, from the bottom of your heart, because there is somebody scrolling past this who needs to know they aren't the only one. Thank you for sitting with us all the way to the end. We wish you good health, quiet days, and peace in your home. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you in the next video.